Hello and welcome to WorkRise Shorts. I'm Kate Bond, Director of Research at WorkRise, a research to action network focused on jobs, workers, and mobility hosted by the Urban Institute. We have a great conversation lined up with Michael Schultz, who is a research scientist in the Economics, Justice, and Society Department at NORC at the University of Chicago. And we'll be diving into their research, which looks at whether low-wage jobs are stepping stones that enable workers to move to higher paid jobs. Michael, welcome. It's great to have you.
Thank you. Really excited to be here. I'm a sociologist and social demographer, and most of my work is around work poverty and structural inequality, particularly low-wage workers. So I'm really excited to have this opportunity. We'll be talking today about a paper with my tremendous colleagues, Ted Mao and Arnie Kalleberg at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And so special thanks to them as I'm kind of here representing our paper today. So looking forward to the conversation.
Great. And that sounds like perfectly aligned with the research that WorkRise is interested in. So before we dive into your findings, can you tell us what the exact problem your research paper addresses or tries to solve for? So like what is the phenomenon you're looking at?
Yeah, so the main question we're trying to kind of get at is how do low-wage workers move to better paying jobs? So we know, for example, that about a quarter of all workers in the US are low-wage workers, and we use a definition of low-wage workers being below about 15 and a half dollars an hour in 2019 dollars. And we also know that low-wage workers change jobs, and they also move out of low wages. So in about 4 years, half of all workers who enter low-wage jobs move to better wages. So we kind of start with the understanding that there is wage mobility and there is occupational mobility. And our question is, how does that mobility occur? And so there's kind of two competing alternative explanations that is in the kind of the title of the paper. The dead end perspective is the idea that the jobs are dead ends. And so the mobility that we observe is due to the characteristics of workers, particularly the ones that we can't typically measure in our labor market surveys. So people point to unobserved skills, ambition, social networks, the kinds of things that aren't on our traditional surveys. So in some ways, it's the workers move up kind of despite the jobs from the dead end perspective. The stepping stone perspective, in contrast, makes the argument that workers in these jobs can accumulate skills over time, and they can also transfer those skills to other jobs where they achieve higher wages. So there's job ladders kind of in our parlance. So workers can use the jobs as stepping stones where it's the structure of the jobs, the fact that the jobs are linked to other jobs and that there's skill linkages that is what's promoting mobility. Now, of course, even from a kind of structural perspective, we think that individual characteristics matter, and we actually kind of think about this as not like an individual versus structure or supply side, worker characteristics and demand side, but really an interaction or an interplay between workers, their current jobs, and their connections in the structure.
So on this, why does it matter to understand these distinctions between a stepping stone and a dead end? Like why does that fundamental question matter?
Yeah, great. So I think it affects the way we think about how this mobility is occurring, kind of affects how we would approach promoting mobility if that's our end goal. So for example, from a dead end perspective, if it's the jobs don't lead anywhere, then we might be thinking more about how do we get the workers out of the jobs into other jobs, formal education, credentials, retraining, these kind of things. If we start to think about mobility as occurring along job ladders, that the jobs lead somewhere, then we want to start thinking about, well, what are the job ladders? Who's moving along them? How are they created? How could you strengthen them, right? So it kind of opens up a whole different set of questions that is, may or may not be related to kind of formal education, but it certainly has a sense of like there is on-the-job training and learning that's occurring, and other institutions that are kind of supporting these job ladders. So I think it changes a little bit of our perspective if we think these job ladders exist or if they don't exist.
Great. And then sort of obviously coming after that, what did you actually find? What were your research findings? And
Yeah,
then a little bit, just because like I'm a little nerdy about this, how did you get to your research findings?
right. Great. So, kind of our big high level finding is that we find that the low wage jobs that we study are stepping stone jobs. So we find strong evidence that workers who accumulate skills, so accumulate experience, and are able to transfer that experience along one of our measures of occupational linkages to more closely linked occupation, they're more likely to move up. So we kind of show the process of mobility. And so kind of what we think at the high level is this validates our kind of understanding of job ladders and job linkages. So a little bit in the weeds here, we have two measures of job linkages. One comes from the ONET skills database. So people who aren't familiar, this is kind of like it's called the Dictionary of Titles is the old version before the internet. And
Mhm.
industrial psychologists primarily go around and observe jobs, and then they say, here are the skills. They use a skills framework. So we take all that detailed information and we correlate it, basically. And we say the jobs that are more linked are the ones where the skills correlate. We have another measure, which we actually becomes our preferred measure, which uses the current population survey. And so the current
Mhm.
population survey has a panel built in. If people aren't familiar, 4 months in, 8 months out, 4 months in. So we can look at month-to-month transitions. Um, and what we create a measure there of workers who flow between pairs of detailed occupations. The higher the flow rate, given the size, is a stronger linkage. And so we think that probably picks up skills, but it also picks up other institutional characteristics. So just to give like one example of where these kind
Mhm.
of two
Please.
measures diverge. So for example, dispatchers and taxi drivers. So ONET says they're not linked together. Taxi drivers drive cars. Dispatchers talk to people and organize, right? Those are kind of different skill sets from an industrial psychology perspective. But of course, dispatchers talk to taxi drivers. And so it's maybe not surprising that there's kind of a job ladder there where people know about dispatching if you're a taxi driver and how to potentially how to get that job. And there's kind of a social interaction. So, starting to pick up other elements in there. So that we create this measure of job ladders, and then we show that it's the experience that transfers. One other kind of finding is that we show that all occupations aren't all equally linked together. And
Mhm.
so this kind of really has important implications when we start to dig in deeper about what are the opportunities from any given job. Like uh, how many linkages are there, how strong they are, what's
Mhm.
the size of the occupation on the other side of the linkage. You could start to think about other characteristics of the occupation that kind of go beyond the scope of our analysis, but kind of moving towards thinking about how kind of the structured labor market and these pathways, shape mobility outcomes.
That's great. And sort of with that level of detail in your findings and all the things you find, my last question is sort of which stakeholders do you think are best positioned to advance your research? So once now that you have this clear understanding from your research, so what do you expect policymakers, certain employers, advocates in certain sectors, or workers themselves are going to be able to do with your research, and what do you hope they'll do or change?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So I think it's important to step back and say, like, we're kind of modeling national level data here. And I think that, policy kind of is made at like a local level, right? And in
Mhm.
particular, industries and sectors. And so we really push, I would say, the national level data that we're using to the limit. So we use the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, 1979 cohort, which is great in the ability to like uh, study workers' long career, and have a huge amount of longitudinal detail on their careers, really have good measures of experience. But the sample size is relatively small. So when we get down into detailed
Mhm.
occupations, it's hard to study all these pathways, individually. So we do supplement that in this analysis with the Survey of Income and Program Participation, the SIP, which has a much larger sample
Mhm.
size. But even so, we're really pushing the limits of the ability to study particular occupations. So we end up with 20 kind of largest categories, in some ways the largest low wage occupations. Uh,
Mhm.
but I do think like once you start shifting in the direction of um, what are the job ladders from a particular place, or how do these job ladders work, right, then you kind of need a different set of data, right? You need to
Mhm.
understand, you need to have a big enough sample size to say, uh, um, here are the way that these flows work and the way that these processes work. So I think that's kind of the next step or iteration of this work, is saying, okay, I think we've shown that uh, these occupational linkage measures, these job ladder measures, they really predict mobility, and they seem to be structuring the labor market. And so we really kind of need to put more direction and study into those things. And that could be quantitative, but that could also be qualitative, right? Like I think people could pick up our work and say, okay, let's start to think about um, trying to identify and understand these job ladders and the institutions that create them. So that's kind of, I think, the direction
Mhm.
we would see
Yeah.
next.
So it seems like to my understanding of it is like your findings point to a future direction for research that would be really, really fruitful to developing those policies. Is you now know where to look for these linkages, and you just need to dig deeper there so that you can find those policy conclusions or those practice conclusions that will lead to these ladders.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I just think it's really important to recognize that, like, and I think our model moves this direction of thinking about the interplay of individuals and the
Mhm.
structure around them. And so, like particular places, particular jobs, and how they're linked together, um, I, is the place, where you can kind of have enough understanding to understand what's really happening. I think that's where, like, as a sociologist, we
Mhm.
kind of cut our teeth on these, ethnographies of particular companies and particular occupations. And so in some ways, what we're trying to do here with these kind of complex quantitative modeling is move in the direction, I think, of a more
Mhm.
real world. How do individuals make your choices? How do they change jobs and move up? I think that's kind of the bigger picture takeaway. And so for researchers, we didn't really dig in here, but there's a lot here in the methods that we're using that I think um, uh, are a potential really step forward, in our ability to kind of model this, and then we kind of need more data is the next step.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much for explaining that. And thank you for joining us and sharing your work with us. We're really excited to see more work on this topic, particularly that is inspired by this research paper itself. So it's great to have you.
Yeah, really excellent to be here, and thank you.